What was just uncovered has left even the world's most skeptical experts speechless, and some of them are refusing to talk about it. What you're about to see is so undeniable, scientists are calling it the most convincing Bigfoot evidence ever recorded in human history. The Bigfoot evidence started with a dent, not a dramatic one, nothing torn from its hinges or crushed inward with the kind of obvious violence that commands immediate attention. Just a subtle crease along the edge of a steel access panel at a remote ridge facility, noted in a maintenance log on an otherwise unremarkable Tuesday in late autumn. Weather damage, most likely. The kind of entry that gets written in the shorthand of mild inconvenience and filed without ceremony, destined to be read by no one and forgotten by morning. The facility itself was the sort of place that didn't invite curiosity. Situated on a forested ridge, accessible only by a single unpaved service road, it had been operational for decades in the quiet, bureaucratic way of infrastructure that exists to serve a function rather than to be noticed. The people who worked there rotated in and out on scheduled shifts, performed their tasks, logged their observations, and drove back down the mountain. It was not the kind of posting that attracted people who asked too many questions. The following day, another maintenance entry appeared. Same panel and same edge. A small bend, nearly identical to the first. Once more, the on-site team shrugged. Metal expands in heat and contracts in cold. A year of weather cycles along a ridge exposed to significant wind loading will work on even heavy-gauge steel. The site engineer added a note about scheduling a repair assessment and turned his attention to other things. A week later, the photographs arrived at headquarters, fresh marks on an adjacent panel, the damage slightly more pronounced this time, the pressure impressions along the lower edge of the deformation a little deeper, a little cleaner. The facilities manager who reviewed the images spent perhaps 90 seconds looking at them before forwarding them to the maintenance queue with a brief note about monitoring the situation. But the Bigfoot marks didn't monitor themselves back into normalcy. They kept appearing. Why would the marks persist if there was no observer or intent behind them? It was only when a junior analyst tasked with compiling a quarterly maintenance summary had the idea to arrange the photographs chronologically, weeks of them, then months, that the dismissals began to feel less comfortable. The images had been reviewed individually, each assessed against the specific context of its logging date, each measured against the narrow question of whether it represented an immediately actionable problem. Seen that way, each one was unremarkable, but laid side by side in sequence, they told a different story entirely. The deformations weren't random. They weren't scattered across the panels the way that weather damage scatters, asymmetrically, following the path of wind and water and thermal expansion. They were clustering, always at the same height, 7 feet, 8 inches above the ground. The analyst noticed this first and made a note of it, uncertain what to make of it, but unwilling to dismiss it. The site engineer, shown the compiled photographs for the first time as a sequence rather than as isolated incidents, went quiet in a way that his colleagues found difficult to interpret. Along the lower edge of each damaged panel, there were narrow pressure impressions, spaced and curved in a way that was unmistakably regular, unmistakably intentional. A structural analysis firm was brought in during the 4th month. Their report used careful language, the language of professionals who understand that conclusions have consequences. But the core finding was unambiguous. The metal had been gripped. The force applied exceeded anything within human physical capability by a significant margin, and the upward scoring across each panel, shallow grooves running from bottom to top, consistent and parallel, did not suggest vandalism or an animal pressing against a surface in confusion. It suggested something trying, deliberately and repeatedly, to find purchase, to pull upward, to open the door. What kind of creature grips reinforced steel with enough force to bend it? And why does it keep returning again and again to the same door? The team documented it carefully. They wrote their reports in the passive voice that institutional documentation favors, the grammatical construction that describes events without assigning agents. The panel was deformed, force was applied, and gripping was indicated. They gathered in the small break room at the end of shifts and spoke about other things, because speaking about this thing required a vocabulary that none of them had yet developed. They didn't need to develop it. The The next piece of Bigfoot evidence arrived before anyone had time to process the first. The first significant rainfall of the season came in early November. 3 days of steady downpour that softened the clay-heavy soil of the service road into the kind of medium that preserves impressions the way wax preserves a seal. The team noticed the tracks on the morning of the 4th day when the rain had stopped and the ground had set enough to hold its shape without collapsing. 17 inches long. No claw marks, no boot heel, no pad structure consistent with any large carnivore native to the region, no bear, no mountain lion, nothing that appeared in any wildlife database the investigators later consulted. Just clean, deep impressions in the reddish mud, the footprint of something that walked fully upright, with an arch that was flexible in the way that only an unshod primate foot is flexible. Its weight transferring smoothly, unhurriedly, from heel to forefoot in a rolling gait that spoke of comfort rather than effort. The impressions were sunk deep, not the shallow depressions of a light-footed animal, but the confident, ground-compressing marks of something very heavy moving without the slightest concern about being noticed. Biomechanical modeling of the stride length and ground pressure, conducted by a university laboratory whose researchers were told only that the samples came from an unknown large animal, returned an estimated body weight of between 700 and 900 pounds. The lead researcher, upon receiving the track casts, reportedly asked twice whether the dimensions had been confirmed before proceeding with the analysis. Could a primate this size truly exist undetected in these woods? More Bigfoot tracks appeared the following morning, a few hundred feet further down the road, identical in every particular to the first set. Then 3 more sets materialized by the end of the week, each perfectly preserved in the still damp soil, each showing the same 17-inch span, the same depth, the same smooth heel to forefoot transfer. The stride interval, the distance between left and right footfalls, indicated a step length consistent with a biped of extraordinary height, moving at an easy, unhurried pace. Not running, not lumbering, walking. The way something walks when it is moving toward a place it knows. Whatever Sasquatch had made these tracks was not injured. The stride showed none of the compensatory asymmetry that an injured limb produces, none of the lateral deviation that signals an animal favoring one side. It carried no additional load that would alter its center of gravity. It was not, by any measure, lost or disoriented. It moved the way a large, healthy animal moves when it is entirely at ease with its environment, the unself-conscious, efficient movement of a body that has made this particular journey many times before. That last quality, the ease, the lack of hesitation, was what the team kept returning to in the weeks that followed, in the conversations they had, and the ones they didn't. Could they understand the pattern before it revealed something irreversible? The tracks didn't circle the facility in the exploratory way of an animal investigating unfamiliar territory. They didn't branch off and double back, or meander toward the building and then veer away. The way that curiosity combined with wariness produces movement. They formed a straight line from the tree line to the facility, and then, precisely, cleanly, without variation, returned along exactly the same path. The outbound and inbound impressions were so perfectly aligned in some stretches that investigators initially wondered whether they were looking at a single set of tracks rather than 2. By the 3rd week of rainfall events and subsequent inspections, Bigfoot's pattern had repeated enough times to move beyond any reasonable interpretation of coincidence. This was not a creature that had stumbled across the building and found something interesting. This was a creature that had known the building was there, had approached it with purpose, and had returned home afterward along a route it had walked so many times that it no longer needed to think about it. The difference between discovery and return is visible in the body, in the quality of movement, and everything about these tracks spoke of return. If the tracks and the door damage were connected, if something was returning to this place on a timetable, what could it possibly want inside? The interior evidence arrived the way most of the evidence in this investigation arrived, quietly, incrementally, in the form of things that were easy to dismiss until they weren't. During routine inspections in the weeks following the confirmation of exterior tracks, team members had been noting faint streaks along the corridor walls. Smudges from maintenance equipment, Most likely. The ordinary residue of a working facility where carts and dollies and cleaning machinery move through tight spaces and leave their marks. Nobody thought twice about them. Somebody wiped them down. Except the height was wrong. The marks sat at roughly 8.5 feet above floor level, well beyond the reach of any standard piece of maintenance equipment, well beyond the casual reach of any person who might brush against a wall while carrying something. And they didn't scatter across the surface the way that incidental contact scatters. They followed the curvature of the corridor walls in a continuous, unbroken line, the trace of a body in motion, something large enough that its shoulder or upper arm or flank maintained sustained contact with the wall surface as it moved through the space, the way a person walking a narrow hallway might trail a hand along the wall, but at a height that belonged to nothing human. What force, intelligence, or habit was guiding these impossible marks? When cleaning staff reported that the marks reappeared almost immediately after standard cleaning cycles, sometimes within 24 hours, the explanation of incidental smudging became untenable. Something was touching these walls with enough regularity that the traces couldn't be fully removed before they were renewed. Laboratory analysis of swab samples collected from the streaks returned results that deepened the unease considerably. The lipid composition of the residue was inconsistent with any human source and inconsistent with any domestic animal source. More significantly, the layering of the deposit, the microscopic stratigraphy of oils and proteins accumulated against the painted concrete, indicated not a single contact event, but repeated contacts sustained over a long period, each visit adding a new layer over the incompletely cleaned remnants of the last. The building had been absorbing this record for longer than anyone on the team had been assigned to the facility. Bigfoot had been moving through those corridors, regularly, repeatedly, for an unknown span of time, and it had left behind a chemical diary that the walls had quietly preserved. Could these walls tell a story the investigators weren't ready to hear? Traced across the full interior and mapped onto the facility's floor plan, the smear patterns formed a coherent route, from the main entrance, through a sequence of primary corridors, towards several secure rooms in the deeper interior. The path was consistent across every documented instance. It didn't vary. Whatever was moving through these spaces moved through them the same way every time, not exploring, not searching, but following a course so well established that deviation from it apparently never occurred. The biological evidence from the perimeter reinforced this picture with unsettling specificity. Hair recovered from the fencing wire, from the grills of exterior vent openings, and from the metal rails of interior stairwells, at heights requiring a vertical reach that would have been impossible for any human without a ladder, provided material for microscopic examination. The results were unambiguous in their strangeness. Hollow shafts with medullary structures that matched nothing in the regional mammal database. Not bear, not elk, not any of the larger animals known to range across that terrain. Growth cycle analysis of multiple samples indicated environmental weathering distributed across more than one seasonal cycle. The hair had not been deposited in a single recent event. It had accumulated over time, shed across visits the way any animal sheds, continuously, incidentally, leaving a little behind each time it passed. Outside the perimeter fence, the surrounding landscape had been keeping its own record. Investigators conducting routine sweeps in the third month began noticing something in the tree line along the facility's approach corridors. Twisted branches, bent limbs, the evidence of deliberate and sustained modification. These were not storm breaks. Clean fractures where sudden force had snapped a branch at its weakest point. They were twist fractures, the kind of damage produced by torque, by something gripping a branch and rotating it slowly until the wood fibers failed, then holding the result in its altered position long enough for the wood to begin to set. The limbs had been bent and held. Their new orientations, when mapped against the facility's access points and plotted alongside the track occurrences, were not random. They formed corridors through the tree line that converged, consistently, on the same monitored zones. But what kind of intelligence reshapes its environment over years of visits? And what was it finding inside the building that made all of that effort worthwhile? The protein residue appeared in the 5th month in locations that added a new dimension to everything the investigation had established so far. It was found on ladder rungs in the utility shafts, on the concrete walls of the access tunnels, in the corners of 3 interior rooms identified by the wall residue mapping as the deepest points of the interior route. The deposits had accumulated in layers, the same patient stratigraphy as the lipid traces in the corridors, suggesting multiple visits over an extended period. Protein-rich compounds bearing markers consistent with physical exertion, the biological byproducts of a Bigfoot, working hard, climbing, maneuvering through tight vertical spaces, had been left behind in concentrations that increased with proximity to the interior resting sites. But it was the corner deposits that shifted the investigation's understanding most significantly. In the angles where 2 walls meet, in the natural shelter of enclosed space, the residue showed a different character, denser, more complex, bearing the markers not of exertion but of rest, of a large warm body settled against a surface for an extended period, of something that had come inside not merely to pass through, but to stop. The facility had been offering shelter, and whatever was visiting it had been accepting that offer repeatedly across seasons. The interior spaces, the secure rooms, the shielded corners, the areas deepest within the building had been functioning as a refuge, a place to rest between the long movements through terrain that was, outside the building's walls, open and exposed and cold. Had the team unknowingly been hosting an occupant for years without realizing it? This realization changed the texture of everything the team had documented. The grip door panels were not acts of aggression or territorial marking. They were the marks of entry, of something that had learned which access points could be coaxed open, which panels yielded to sustained upward pressure, and had returned to those same points so many times that the steel bore a record of every visit. The corridor route, trodden so consistently that it left chemical traces on the walls, was the path between the entrance and the refuge. The modified tree line was the approach to a place that had become, in some meaningful sense, a destination. They were not dealing with intrusions. They were dealing with something far stranger, and in its own way, more remarkable, a Bigfoot that had incorporated a human facility into its own life, its shelter network, its movement pattern, its seasonal rhythm, and had been doing so quietly, invisibly, for years. The temperature logs confirmed this reading from a direction no one had anticipated. For as long as the environmental monitoring system had been operational, the logs had contained small, unexplained anomalies, localized warm spots in rooms that had no active equipment, appearing during periods of scheduled inactivity, persisting for durations that didn't match any known electrical phenomenon. They had been attributed over the years to sensor drift, to residual heat from equipment recently powered down, to the vagaries of climate control systems in aging infrastructure. Nobody had looked at them as a pattern because nobody had reason to. What else had been quietly recorded that nobody had thought to check? Pulled from the archive and mapped against everything else the investigation had assembled, the thermal record transformed. The warm spots appeared in the same rooms, always the rooms at the deepest end of the corridor route, always the rooms where protein deposits had accumulated in corners. They rose gradually over the span of 30 to 40 minutes and fell slowly over an hour or more, the exact thermal profile of a large warm-blooded body entering an enclosed space, stabilizing its temperature against the ambient air, and then withdrawing. Not the abrupt spike of equipment cycling, not the rapid dissipation of residual heat from a recently active machine. The measured organic rise and fall of a living body occupying a room. If the building's own temperature sensors had been tracking these visits for years, what else might the facility's systems have recorded without anyone realizing it? Sound of Bigfoot was the second to the last piece of the physical record to be fully understood, and in certain ways, it was the most disquieting. Could hearing its presence finally reveal what sight and touch had only hinted at? The acoustic monitoring equipment positioned along the facility's perimeter had been installed for entirely practical reasons: to detect unauthorized vehicle access, to flag anomalous machinery noise to provide an additional layer of environmental awareness in an isolated location where problems could go unnoticed for hours. The microphones were sensitive, calibrated for a broad frequency range, and had been running continuously for years. They had accumulated an enormous archive of ambient sound, wind through the ridge's tree line, the calls of birds, and the more distant cries of larger animals, the mechanical hum of the facility's own systems, the occasional acoustic artifact of weather. Within all of that, buried in hundreds of hours of unremarkable ambient recording, were sounds that did not belong. They had been noted occasionally in the logs, low-frequency vocalization, possible wildlife origin, undetermined source, wind artifact, probable. The notations were brief, the conclusions dismissive, the recordings unflagged for further review. Nobody had gone back to listen carefully because the context that would have made careful listening seem necessary did not yet exist. In the investigation's fourth month, with the thermal, physical, and biological record now largely assembled, a researcher working through the acoustic archive found the first clearly anomalous recording, a sequence of low-frequency sounds sustained over approximately 4 minutes, bearing a rising and falling modulation that was inconsistent with anything the facility's environmental profile could explain. Not wind. Wind through trees produces a broadband noise without the kind of discrete frequency variation this recording showed. Not a known animal. The calls of every large mammal in the regional database had been run against the sample, and none matched. Not mechanical. The facility's equipment produced no sounds in this frequency range during inactivity periods. Bigfoot sound had structure. It had, in the specific technical sense that acoustic analysts use the word intentionality, a quality of rising and falling that implied not random noise, but produced vocalization, something generated by a larynx and shaped by the kind of neurological control that separates communication from ambient noise. Once this first recording was flagged, the archive review became targeted and systematic. Researchers pulled every acoustic anomaly from the full span of the archive, aligned them against the thermal and physical timeline, and found what they had, by this point, come to expect: a pattern. Low-frequency vocalizations appearing consistently during the same intervals as thermal elevation events. Sounds at the perimeter corresponding temporally to the arrivals and departures that the door deformation logs and track evidence had already documented. But the timing revealed something more specific still. In some recordings, the vocalizations preceded the interior thermal spikes by a narrow margin, 10, 15, 20 minutes, as though what was approaching had announced itself at the tree line before crossing the open ground to the entrance. In others, the sounds came after the thermal record had already begun its decline, trailing the withdrawal, marking the departure, the way a door closing behind someone marks the end of a visit. A few recordings captured both, a sound at arrival and a sound at departure, bracketing the thermal event the way a parenthetical statement brackets an aside. Beginning, middle, end. Each visit, the investigators now understood, had a complete acoustic shape. Bigfoot had a signature, the Sasquatch, and they had stopped by this point pretending that the word was anything other than accurate, announced itself when it came and when it left, and the facility's own perimeter equipment had been faithfully recording both for longer than anyone cared to calculate. One recording, pulled from an archive 7 years old and run through enhancement software that had not existed when it was made, contained a sequence of sounds that stopped the acoustics researcher mid-session. She listened to it 3 times before calling a colleague. The modulation in that particular recording was more complex than in the others, more varied, longer, with what appeared to be a repetitive internal structure that recurred at intervals across the 4-minute sequence. She was careful in her notes about what language she used: possible structured patterning, repetitive internal motif, inconsistent with known environmental sources. But the language she used when she called her colleague was simpler and less careful. I think it might be saying something. Nobody followed that thread any further. There was, perhaps, a limit to how far down any of them were willing to go. The sounds had structure. The visits had a rhythm. The evidence had been accumulating for years in every system the facility contained. What would the cameras, the eyes of the building, finally show? The surveillance system had never been designed with this in mind. The cameras were operational tools installed to monitor the movement of people and machinery through a working facility. Their placement had followed the logic of security rather than investigation. Doors, corridors, storage areas, the primary approaches to the building. The first sequence to yield something unambiguous came from an exterior camera positioned near a service entrance, one of the access points the structural analysis had already identified years earlier as a repeated site of panel deformation. The recording was from a winter night nearly 2 decades old. The ambient light in the frame was the low, diffuse illumination of a clear night at altitude, sufficient to read detail in familiar objects, insufficient to resolve detail in unfamiliar ones. The frame darkened gradually, not the sudden eclipse of a passing cloud, not the irregular flicker of branches moving in the wind. A gradual, steady occlusion of ambient light across a portion of the frame, as though something large and opaque was moving into the camera's field from one side, blocking the light sources beyond it, with the steady, deliberate progress of a body bearing consistent weight and moving with directional intent. The darkening tracked from right to left across the lower portion of the frame, unhurried, steady, the visual signature of mass in motion rather than weather or atmospheric effect. When the footage was set against the door deformation log from the same night, the correspondence was exact. The frame darkened at the precise moment the structural sensors had registered strain on the access panel. The door shifted visibly, a small movement caught only because the analysts knew to look for it, because they had been told where and when the strain sensors had recorded their data. And then the darkness moved beyond the camera's field of view, leaving behind only the residual visual disturbance of its passage. Interior footage from the same night continued the sequence without interruption. A corridor camera mounted near the main hallway junction recorded something crossing its field approximately 11 minutes after the exterior camera's event. A broad, textured silhouette moving from left to right across the lower portion of the frame. Not the sharp, quick-edged outline of a person passing at standard walking speed, but a slower, heavier displacement, something that absorbed the ambient light rather than reflecting it, that moved at a height which corresponded precisely to the residue streaks the lipid analysis had mapped along those same walls. Across the full span of the documented footage, covering visits distributed across nearly 2 decades, Bigfoot's pattern never broke. Different seasons, different lighting conditions, different cameras, different years. The same structure, the same route, the same rhythm, the same quality of unhurried familiarity. A record of Bigfoot that had learned this place thoroughly and completely. Learned it the way you learn a place that has become, over years of return, a part of your own geography. After 20 years of visits recorded across every system the building contained, what does it mean that the visits, as far as anyone could determine, had never stopped? The visit cycle, when the team last checked, remained at every 2 to 4 weeks, as regular as it had ever been. Bigfoot had learned this place had not stopped coming, and now, at last, we have learned to see it.